everyone. You guys can come out as well. Nice to see everyone again. So yesterday, I had the opportunity to meet with about a dozen high school students from all over the islands, and they're participating in a program called Converge, which we're supporting in collaboration with HCAT, Hawaii Energy, Green Biz, Roberts Hawaii, DBED, and the Blue Planet Foundation. If the students are here, can you please stand up? Okay. So these students are spending their summer vacation coming to this conference. And they have amazing superpowers. One of them can recite pi to the 80th digit. And then another one has superhuman athletic strength. But one of the things that we discussed was the transcending oil study that Dawn mentioned yesterday, and specifically around the mobility space. And you can kind of look at, so in transportation planning and urban planning, you can solve for a multitude of things. So level of service, land use, placemaking, safety is a big one. But one of the things that we can do now is really solve for decarbonization. And an easy way to think about that is vehicle efficiency, fuel type, and then travel demand. And a lot of the conversations that we've been having thus far is around vehicle efficiency, so CAFE standards, and then fuel type, which is electric vehicles, fuel cells, hybrids, that type of thing. But what I'm really excited to talk about today is travel demand. And so that really speaks to multimodal transportation, rail, land use, bike share, biking. And then one of my longtime mentors always said that every single trip starts with the pedestrian experience, so walking, no matter what mode you're taking. And during this conversation, I asked the students, if you were to choose between your cell phone and your car, which one would you choose? Do you know what they chose? Cell phone? Yeah, all of them chose cell phone, or most of them did. And I found this really interesting because right now, the data shows that we are driving more than ever. In the last 10 years, we're driving 7% more in Hawaii. For the first time ever, we have surpassed petroleum use in ground transportation. So we're using more petroleum in ground transportation than in the entire electric grid, which is outstanding to me in a bad way. And then if we don't do anything and just act as we're normally doing right now, we're actually potentially going to drive 17% more across the islands by 2045. And most of that is actually going to be happening, most of that increase is actually going to be happening on the neighbor islands. So one of the things that, if I can kind of borrow a statement from Josh Stamber yesterday, he said, show me your budget, I'll show you your values. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to share the stage with Ford Fujigami, who advises the governor, and he kind of took a transportation twist on it, and he said, show me your shoes, I'll show you your values. So, walking shoes. Walking shoes right there, walking socks as well. So I wanted to ask Harrison, the community building and transit-oriented development administrator, what have the choices in land use that we've made tell us about our priorities, about the way we move and what we care about? And what are some initiatives that are underway that are potentially shifting these priorities?
In Hawaii, especially focused on Honolulu, which is my day job, we've got some good news, some bad news, and then some great news, I would say. The good news is, if you're not from here, Hawaii sprawl is compact. I think recognized decades ago that land is limited here, so we've got roughly 105,000 residential lots on Oahu. 120, the math is that's a little less than 1/10 of 1%, is 1 acre lots. Everything else is, 6 units to the acre, 8 units to the acre, 12, 15, 20. So really compact, even our sprawl. The second thing is that all the neighborhoods have centers. We have a history of building our elementary schools and our parks in the middle of the neighborhoods, even in the suburban kind of lollipop, subdivisions. There's always a center, a school and park at the center. And that tends to make it walkable. Our zoning and policies for decades have been to create mixed use, to create more density. Now, it's not saying there's not a lot of sprawl in the last 20, 30 years, but it's shifting back towards that, and strong policies even before the rail system, even before transit-oriented development to have density, and there's a great acceptance of that here. The biggest problem is the lack of connectivity. And our roads, we've made the same mistake a lot of cities. Our roads are too big, too wide. A lot of our blocks are really too long. We're not Kansas or even Portland. We don't really have connected grids except in a lot of the older neighborhoods. And so it's really kind of hard to get around. But the basics of the density is really important. And that is, I think, one of the ways that we get out. Because roads are fixable, and you can require more connectivity. We also have a car bias culture. We keep getting beat up whenever we try and add, bike lanes and, take one parking lot, but that's also something that's fixable. And, there's great initiatives going on at the city with a lot of partners to work on those things. In terms of the solutions and good news, Andy's going to talk about the rail, building a 20-mile long rail system that's about half built. If you haven't gone out and looked at it, please do before you go. I've been back, I worked here 20 years ago on similar stuff, but I've been back for about 5 years, and we've been working on the TOD plans for 11 years. So, 20-mile corridor, most of our TOD plans are adopted. We've adopted the zoning, and the cities, unlike a lot of systems, the cities adopting the zoning to make it easier to develop. You'll get a massive amount of additional density and height as long as you provide community benefits, affordable housing, connectivity investments. We've approved kind of 5 developments so far under an interim negotiated permit, and every one of those is including affordable housing, as well as streetscape improvements, connectivity improvements, bike share stations, and things like that. So we're seeing the kind of rubber hit the road with the improvements for the vision of TOD. We also, I've never worked in a city that actually has all the departments working together, better than ever. We have a bi-weekly all the infrastructure directors meeting to actually implement TOD. So departments are working together. And in the great news, the city and the state are really working together on TOD planning, because there's about 1,900 acres of developable state along the corridor, and developing TOD plans to implement that. Now, I would say what's missing a little bit, this is a challenge to the room. I'm going to ask a question for the environmentalists here. How many of you work on anything related to land use anytime recently? Not a lot of hands, okay, which is to be expected, why we're having the panel. Getting the land use right is the gift that keeps on giving. I used to do a lot of consulting on analysis, climate analysis, and if you compare how much benefit you get in reduced demand and reduced energy use and reduced driving from land use, it's something that just keeps on giving forever, independent of the technology. So I would say the biggest challenge is really getting those of you and all your allies to really support the land use policies, the public investments, the bike lanes, the neighborhood fights about whether or not we should make a transportation improvement. And I think the energy and environmental folks really need to focus a little bit more on implementation of the land use solutions.
In my prior life, I used to work for HART, actually. And I remember working with Harrison Rue and a lot of the other city administrators and department heads, and we did these things called walk audits, where we went to every station area and actually walked around the entire station area to see what was working really well and where there could be improvements. And I would encourage every one of you to actually think about your built environment and audit it in terms of walkability or bikeability, or just kind of like placemaking and comfort. So when Harrison says that, he's actually right that there is a lot of collaboration. And in addition to the TOD plans, the land use ordinance is also under revision right now. So is that something that folks can get involved in?
Yeah, there will be. We're just in information gathering right now. The land use ordinance has been around for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, and really in planning for a complete update over the next few years. So pay attention to that and get involved.
Okay, so I'm going to shift over to Andy Robbins, who's the Executive Director and CEO of the Honolulu Authority for Rapid Transportation. And to settle any disputes, I'm just going to start off by saying, it's going to the airport, don't worry. So I sit at the nexus of mobility, energy, agriculture, water, and innovation. And one of my favorite things about the rail project is that it's incredibly innovative. I mean, we're going to be the first, I don't want to steal all of your thunder, but the first automated electric train in the United States, and the second in North America after the SkyTrain in Vancouver, Canada. So I was wondering if you could talk about how HART is improving our mobility options and also some of the innovative technologies and thinking that you're incorporating into the project.
Okay, well, thank you. I think fundamentally what the rail system is going to do is to really improve the mobility, people moving around the system, around the city, and then also connectivity, as Harrison mentioned, which also fosters efficient land use, convenient trips for people. So fundamentally, that's what we're doing. The technology that we're using, as you mentioned, is a driverless technology, which gives us a lot of flexibility, and it also sort of downsizes the footprint a bit. So, for example, our trains, our 4-car trains, are going to be 240 feet long. Compare that to the BART system, for example, which is an 800-foot train. So that just scales down the station sizes. The whole scale of the system is scaled down. However, the capacity of the system through the driverless technology and the service that we can achieve with driverless technology is still very, very high. So we're building a lot of capacity, a high capacity system. And fundamentally what we're doing is we're going to put 120,000 people a day in electric vehicles. So I don't know if everybody realizes that, but certainly we want to have the complementary electric vehicles on the road and the emerging autonomous shuttles to provide first mile, last mile connectivity. But the backbone for mobility in the system will be an electric transportation system. And I think that's a really important point to grasp.
So 120,000 people in this train per day, that's incredible. To kind of give some context, those who are familiar with the bike share system, in the first 6 months, and this is an integrative system, so I'm not trying to poo-poo bike share or anything, but in the first 6 months, it was 360,000 trips per day. So within 2 days of riding the train, we'll have done as many trips as 6 months of bike share. I mean, that volume is incredible.
Yeah, that's the projected ridership, and after we open the system, the capacity is actually greater than that, and through the technology, we can increase the service. So for example, during the peak service when we first open, we'll have about 5 minutes between trains, but we can have that eventually and be around 2 minutes between trains, and essentially double the capacity. So the growth potential is there; it's built into the system.
Even need to check the timetable to find out when it's coming, which is fantastic.
Right. So, for example, you mentioned the Vancouver SkyTrain. Vancouver actually went into service in 1986, so it's quite a mature system at this point. Their time between trains, or headway as we call it, is 108 seconds. So the convenience factor is incredible. There's no schedules. You don't have to consult a schedule. We won't have a schedule either. And really, the rail system becomes sort of like another utility where you turn the water on, you expect the water to come out. Just the same with the rail system. You show up at a station, you expect the train to come. And that's the kind of service that we want to offer. The side benefit of that from an economic standpoint is what they saw in Vancouver is that with that kind of convenience, the ridership increases and therefore the revenue into the system increases as well.
So So speaking of economics, Amanda, so we have Amanda Eakin here from the National Resource Defense Council. She's the Director of Transportation and Climate for the Urban Solutions Program. And one of the recommendations that we saw in Transcending Oil is putting a value or a price on both parking and driving. And you have some interesting ways of thinking about this, and I was wondering if you could dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. Thanks, Aki, but I also just want to thank all of you for being here. This is really the leading edge of Hawaii's efforts to move towards a clean energy future, so it's great to have you all in the room. I'm glad that you spoke a bit about the idea of the rail as a utility, because we've been having similar conversations about the transportation sector. And there's a professor, Mike Manville at UCLA, we work with a lot, and he compares transportation to other utilities, such as electricity and water, where in the case of energy, for example, in North America, we have something like 38 authorities, they're called balancing authorities. Their job is to balance supply and demand every day in this very fine-tuned way so that we don't have blackouts. We don't come to expect blackouts as a daily occurrence. What he says is in the transportation sector, we just lack that kind of entity. And so what we have every day is twice a day, our transportation system essentially fails. We have far too much supply for the limited demand of road space that we have, and therefore we all sit in this mind-numbing, maddening traffic congestion. Nobody likes to sit in traffic congestion. And so the idea of these pricing programs, or what we're calling in Los Angeles, where I'm doing some work, we're calling it a go zone. The idea of these pricing programs, it is really a supply and demand mechanism for managing this finite space. And the go zone concept, you would take a traffic hotspot, let's say it's downtown Honolulu or downtown Los Angeles, and you put together an integrated package of mobility solutions. So you'd have those rapid transit available at 5-minute headways, so it's just the most convenient thing. You would, of course, have bus-only lanes, so the bus doesn't sit in all the traffic. You'd be able to have a faster trip on the bus. You'd look at creating safer streets for walking and biking, and you'd have, in addition to all these innovative mobility services, something called a decongestion fee. And essentially that is to manage the supply and demand of the road space. What that decongestion fee does, as the Los Angeles Times put it when they editorialized in favor of this concept, is it makes people kind of pause and reconsider. Do I need to drive, and do I need to drive right now? And you're talking about, in some cases, in the case of Stockholm or London, it's about $2 to $4 US. You're not talking about a lot of money. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee. But just the presence of that fee makes people consider, do I want to drive, and do I want to drive right now? In those cases in London and Stockholm, just the presence of that very modest fee was enough to make 20% of drivers shift to something else. Either shift to a different time of day, shift to taking transit, walking, biking, carpooling, telecommuting, whatever your choices are. In the case of London, that translated to 90,000 fewer vehicles driving into central London during the peak period. And that transforms your city. The headlines in London following implementation are really stunning. Of course, leading up to this, it was panned by the papers. Nobody wanted it. This was going to be a disaster. Former Mayor Ken Livingston called it, Bloody Sunday when this is going to be coming. And then the headlines following are just unbelievable. It's like the day the air filled with bird songs instead of traffic fumes. London has that Sunday morning feeling, is how they describe it, and it's just transformative. Of course, what these systems also do is because there's a modest fee on those who continue to drive, it creates a revenue stream. London, that's about 150 million pounds per year. It's delivered about $2 billion so far, 2 billion pounds so far. That then creates this sort of virtuous cycle of transportation where you have a revenue stream, you can put into more and more transit availability, safe bike lanes, innovative mobility services like electric bike share and ride share and flexibly routed micro-transit services. And that really gets the whole system working. And the fascinating thing to track is while public opinion was opposed to this concept before in Stockholm, London, before implementation, after it's implemented, 70% of people say, we love this. We actually don't want to take this away. In Stockholm, they did 6 months, they took it out, traffic went back up, and then they put it to the voters, and the voters voted it back in. And they said, this is a wonderful thing for our city, and we really want to do this. And the environmental benefit, this is one of the single most impactful environmental actions you could take, and it turns out that people love it. So I would love to continue a conversation about how something like a go zone could help to return Honolulu to the paradise it really should be.
Yeah, and on a very micro scale, I just keep thinking about surge pricing for ride hailing. And so maybe something to think about as we evaluate how those policies are going to pan out over time. Yeah.
Although I'll say about the surge, I think the surge catches people off guard because there's no predictability about it, and so sometimes people will 100%, 200%. In the case of these congestion charge schemes, you know what you're going to pay. It's very well vetted with the community in advance. It's a modest charge. And then the thing that it really does, in Los Angeles, we found out that during the peak period, during that time when the system fails, over 50% of the trips are not work trips. They're not people that necessarily need to be going to get your milk at 8:45 in the morning. But just because there's nothing discouraging you from doing that, then people are making all these sorts of trips that they would happily shift out of the peak period. There's just no incentive or disincentive to do so. So the idea here is to sort of align financial incentives with the goals we want to see.
Thanks. So to close up, just one last question. In one word or phrase, what is the most important discussion that we're not having enough of?
Well, maybe I could start, and I suppose there is discussion on it, but I think just in terms of Honolulu and Hawaii, as we continue to grow, as our visitor industry and visitor arrivals continue to grow, how do we tackle the mobility question and create a sustainable transportation system going forward?
I would say, I think really the whole pricing policy about new mobility, we keep getting slammed with new rollouts of disruptive industries. Lime was the most recent, and typically I'm looking ahead to fleets of autonomous electric vehicles, and the equipment manufacturers dumping their fleets, and it'll lead to a lot more congestion. So we need to get on top. It's not just the congestion charge, it's the access to roads and how we're managing that over the next couple of decades.
Can I close us out,
Yeah.
Amanda?
I would say the question is, are we doing everything we can to give people an option to get out of traffic? I think there are proven case studies from around the world that there are very implementable solutions that could work here. And are we giving people those chances? Nobody likes to sit in traffic. So are we putting in place the smartest policy solutions we know work to get people moving again?
Thank you.
All right. I would add that Amanda will be digging deeper into these topics at 3 o'clock. Yeah.
Great. 3 o'clock. Everyone, check out our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.